I almost died because I didn't believe a text message. I was standing barefoot on freezing pavement at 2 in the morning, wearing nothing but pajama pants and a thin hoodie, watching firefighters and bomb squad units surround my apartment building. My phone was clutched in my shaking hand, still showing my landlord's text from 2 hours earlier. The text I almost deleted. The text I thought was some kind of sick prank. Red and blue lights painted the faces of my neighbors as we huddled together behind police tape, and none of us could speak. We just stood there, staring at the home we'd almost died in, because my downstairs neighbor, the quiet man I'd waved to maybe 3 times in 2 years, had been building something in his apartment, something none of us knew about, something that would have turned our entire building into rubble and taken all of us with it. They found 200 pounds of explosives in his living room. 200 pounds. And my bedroom was directly above it. I need to take you back to before that night, so you can understand how I ended up ignoring the one warning that could have saved my life. My name is Priya, and at 26 years old, I thought I had everything figured out. I worked as a freelance graphic designer from my small one-bedroom apartment in Trenton, New Jersey. The building was a converted Victorian house that had been split into 4 units, and I lived in Unit 2 on the 2nd floor. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I had my own space, my own schedule, my own little corner of independence that I'd fought hard to build. My mornings started slow, the way I liked them. I'd make coffee in my tiny kitchen and take it out onto the narrow balcony overlooking the street. I'd watch joggers pass by and listen to birds wake up in the oak tree next to the building. Then I'd spend my days on video calls with clients, designing logos and social media graphics and brand kits for small businesses trying to make their mark. In the evenings, I'd go for runs along the trail at the nearby park, clearing my head after hours of staring at a screen. My younger brother, Kavi, lived about 20 minutes away, and every Sunday without fail, he'd show up at my door with takeout containers and a new complaint about his roommates. He was 23 and still figuring things out, and I liked that he came to me for advice, even when I didn't have answers. Our mother Sunita called me every single night at 8 o'clock sharp from her place in Delaware. She'd been calling at the same time since I moved out, and if I didn't answer by the 3rd ring, she'd assume I was dead in a ditch somewhere. "Priya, you live alone," she'd remind me at least once a week. A mother worries. My landlord was a man named Mr. Tedesco, a 68-year-old retired contractor who had inherited the building from his father decades ago. He was old school in every way. He preferred phone calls over texts, printed receipts over email, and firm handshakes over casual waves. He lived across town but stopped by once a month to check on things and collect rent. He always wore pressed button-down shirts, even just to fix a leaky faucet. I liked him. He reminded me of my grandfather. The other tenants were people I saw but didn't really know. Unit 3 was home to an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Huang, who had lived there for over 15 years. Mrs. Huang always smiled at me in the hallway, and once left a container of homemade dumplings at my door during Lunar New Year. Unit 4, the small attic apartment, belonged to a nursing student named Delia. She was around my age, always exhausted, always carrying textbooks that looked heavier than she was. We chatted a few times about how impossible it was to find parking on our street. And then there was Unit 1, the ground floor apartment, directly below mine. The man who lived there was named Warren Briggs. He was in his early 40s, though he looked older, thin, pale, with deep circles under his eyes that made it seem like he hadn't slept well in years. He kept to himself completely. In the 2 years I'd lived in that building, I don't think I ever had a full conversation with him. I'd say hello when we passed in the hallway or at the mailboxes, and he'd mumble something back without making eye contact. I figured he was shy, maybe going through something, maybe just one of those people who preferred to be left alone. I noticed things about him, sure, but I explained them all away the way people do when they don't want to get involved in someone else's business. There were smells sometimes, chemical smells, sharp and strange, drifting up through the floor vents. I told myself it was cleaning products. Maybe he was really particular about keeping his place spotless. There were sounds too, thumping and scraping at odd hours, late at night or early in the morning. I figured he was rearranging furniture or moving things around. He seemed like the restless type. Once, around midnight, I was coming home from a late dinner with Kavi when I saw Warren unloading heavy bags from his trunk. They looked like fertilizer bags, the kind you'd see at a garden supply store. I remember thinking it was strange because our building didn't have a yard, and I'd never seen him do any gardening anywhere. But I shrugged it off. Maybe he had a community garden plot somewhere. Maybe he was helping a friend. It wasn't my business. His trash cans were always overflowing with packaging materials. Cardboard boxes, bubble wrap, packing peanuts. I assumed he was ordering a lot of things online, which wasn't exactly unusual. Everyone ordered stuff online. Delia mentioned once that she thought he was weird. He never talks to anyone, she said. I held the door open for him last week and he walked past me like I wasn't even there. Mrs. Huang told me she'd knocked on his door once to invite him to a building potluck, and he'd opened it just a crack, said he wasn't interested, and closed it in her face. Strange man, she said, shaking her head. But harmless, I'm sure. Harmless. That's what we all told ourselves. He was strange, but harmless. Quiet, but harmless. Rude, but harmless. We had no idea that right below our feet, in the apartment where we assumed he was just living his lonely life, he was building something that would have killed every single one of us. And I was about to find out the hard way that ignoring warning signs doesn't make them go away. Subscribe for more stories, and tell me where you're watching from. It was a Thursday night in early November when everything changed. I'd been working late on a logo design for a client who had already asked for 7 rounds of revisions, and still wasn't happy. By the time I finally closed my laptop, my eyes were burning and my neck was stiff from hunching over my desk. It was almost midnight. I pushed back from my chair, stretched my arms over my head, and decided I'd deal with the client's latest round of notes in the morning. I was too tired to care anymore. I changed into my pajamas, washed my face, and was just about to plug in my phone for the night when it buzzed with a text. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. I almost ignored it, assuming it was spam or a wrong number. But something made me look. The message said, "This is Tedesco. Leave the building now. Don't pack anything, just run. I'll explain later. Please trust me." I stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was reading. Mr. Tedesco never texted. In 2 years, every communication I'd had with him was either a phone call or a handwritten note slipped under my door. He was the kind of man who complained about how nobody talked face to face anymore. Why would he suddenly be texting me from a number I didn't recognize, telling me to run? My first thought was that it was a scam, some kind of phishing thing where someone pretended to be your landlord to get you to click a link or send money. But there was no link, no request for anything, just a demand that I leave immediately. My second thought was that one of my friends was messing with me. Maybe Kavi had given out my number as a joke, or maybe Delia upstairs was bored and thought this would be funny. But it didn't feel like a joke. The wording was too serious, too urgent. I texted back, "Who is this really?" I waited. No response. I set my phone down on my nightstand and walked to my bedroom door. I opened it slowly and looked out into the hallway. The building was completely silent. The overhead light flickered slightly the way it always did, casting dim shadows on the worn carpet. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing felt wrong. I pressed my ear against the floor, listening for any sound from the apartment below, Warren's place. All I heard was silence. No movement, no voices, no strange noises, just the quiet hum of the building settling the way old buildings do. I walked to my window and looked out at the street. Empty. A few parked cars sat along the curb, the same ones that were always there. A streetlight buzzed faintly at the corner. No police cars, no fire trucks, no sign that anything unusual was happening. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I was being paranoid. It was probably just a wrong number, or some weird glitch, or a scam that hadn't finished loading. I walked back to my bed and picked up my phone to delete the message. That's when it buzzed again. "Priya, please, the police are on their way. You need to get out. Unit 1, he's dangerous. Please, just go." My stomach dropped straight to the floor. He used my name. Whoever this was knew my name, and they mentioned Unit 1 specifically, Warren's apartment. I sat down on the edge of my bed, my heart beating faster now. This didn't feel like a scam anymore. This felt real. But what was I supposed to do? Run out into the street in my pajamas because of 2 text messages? What if it was still some kind of trick? What if someone was trying to get me to leave so they could break into my apartment? I texted back, "What's happening? What about Unit 1? I watched the screen, waiting for those 3 little dots to appear, waiting for some kind of explanation. Nothing came. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. I stood up and walked back to my door. I opened it again and stepped into the hallway, listening harder this time. I could hear the faint sound of Delia's television playing upstairs, some late-night talk show with muffled laughter. I could hear the building's old pipes groaning the way they always did, but nothing else. No shouting, no sirens, no footsteps. I stood there frozen in the hallway, caught between feeling like a fool and feeling like something was terribly wrong. Part of me wanted to bang on Delia's door and ask if she'd gotten a weird text too. Part of me wanted to call Kavi and have him tell me I was overreacting, but it was almost 1 in the morning. Everyone was asleep, and I had nothing to show them except 2 strange messages that probably meant nothing. I made a decision. I was tired. I was stressed from work. I was letting my imagination run wild because some scammer had guessed my name. I walked back into my apartment, closed the door, and locked it. I checked the lock twice just to make myself feel better. Then I told myself I would call Mr. Tedesco first thing in the morning and figure out what this was all about. I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth. I squeezed toothpaste onto my brush, ran it under the water, and had just brought it to my mouth when my walls started shaking. At first, I thought it was a truck passing by, a big one, maybe an 18-wheeler taking a wrong turn down our narrow street. The vibration was low and steady, rattling the mirror above my bathroom sink. My toothbrush froze halfway to my mouth as I waited for it to stop. But it didn't stop. It got stronger. The shaking moved through the walls and into the floor beneath my feet. My shampoo bottles toppled off. The edge of the bathtub. The overhead lights swayed slightly. And then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Voices outside. Male voices. Deep and commanding. Shouting words I couldn't quite make out. I dropped my toothbrush into the sink and ran to my window. What I saw made me forget how to breathe. Police cars were flooding the street. Not 1 or 2, but at least a dozen, their red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. Officers in tactical gear were pouring out of black vans, moving with the kind of speed and precision I'd only ever seen in movies. A spotlight from somewhere I couldn't see suddenly hit my building, so bright it made me squint and step back from the glass. A megaphone crackled to life, the sound cutting through the chaos outside. All residents of 247 Maple Street, exit the building immediately through the rear entrance. This is not a drill. Leave now. Do not stop to collect belongings. Exit through the rear entrance immediately. For a moment, I just stood there, paralyzed. My brain couldn't catch up to what was happening. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Things like this happened in other places, to other people. Not here, not to me. The megaphone repeated the command, more urgent this time. My body finally started moving before my thoughts could organize themselves. I didn't grab my laptop. I didn't grab my wallet or my keys or even a jacket. I just shoved my bare feet into the sneakers I'd left by the door, snatched my phone off the nightstand, and ran. The hallway was no longer quiet. I could hear doors opening above and below me, footsteps pounding, voices rising in confusion and fear. I took the back stairwell 2 steps at a time, nearly tripping on the last flight. My hand slammed against the emergency exit door and I burst out into the cold November air. The cold hit me like a wall. I was wearing thin pajama pants and a hoodie, nothing else. My breath came out in white puffs as I stumbled away from the building, trying to get my bearings. An officer appeared out of nowhere and grabbed my arm, not rough, but firm. "This way, ma'am. Keep moving. Don't stop." He guided me toward a barrier that had been set up 2 blocks away. I could see other people already gathered there, wrapped in blankets that someone must have handed out. I spotted Delia first. She was standing near the barrier in her bathrobe, her face streaked with tears, her whole body trembling. When she saw me, she reached out and grabbed my hand without saying a word. Mr. and Mrs. Huang came next, shuffling toward us with an officer on either side. Mrs. Huang was clutching her husband's arm so tight her knuckles had gone white. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. Mr. Huang's face was pale and blank, like he couldn't process what was happening around him. None of us spoke. We just stood there together, four neighbors who had never been more than polite strangers, holding on to each other as we watched our building get surrounded by more emergency vehicles than I could count. SWAT trucks, fire engines, an unmarked van with no windows that made my stomach turn just looking at it. I pulled out my phone and called Mr. Tedesco. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tap the screen. He answered before the first ring finished. Priya. His voice was ragged, like he'd been crying or shouting or both. Thank God. Thank God you're out. What is happening? My voice cracked on the last word. What is going on? He told me everything. 3 hours earlier, he'd gotten a call from an FBI agent. They'd been monitoring Warren Briggs for months. They'd been tracking his online purchases, watching his movements, building a case. The agent told Mr. Tedesco that Warren had been accumulating materials consistent with bomb making, chemicals, wiring, fertilizer. They believed he was days away from completing a device, maybe hours. They needed Mr. Tedesco to quietly warn all the residents without alerting Warren that anything was wrong. He'd called everyone. He'd texted everyone. His main phone had died, so he'd borrowed his wife's phone to send the messages. I called you 4 times, he said. I texted you twice. You never answered. I thought you weren't coming out. I thought I was going to watch them carry you out of there. His voice broke on the last sentence, and I felt something crack open in my chest. This man, who I'd only ever seen in pressed shirts and polite formality, was crying on the phone because he thought I was going to die, because I almost did. I looked back at my building, at the officers moving in careful formation, at the robots being deployed toward the front entrance. I thought about how close I came to going back to sleep, how close I came to brushing my teeth and climbing into bed and never waking up again. And I couldn't say anything. I just stood there in the freezing cold, tears running down my face, watching everything I thought I knew fall apart. The next 3 hours were the longest of my entire life. We stood behind that police barrier in the freezing cold, huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck. Someone from the Red Cross showed up at some point and handed out thin emergency blankets, the kind that crinkle like aluminum foil when you move. I wrapped one around my shoulders, but it didn't help. The cold had gotten inside me, and it had nothing to do with the November air. Delia wouldn't let go of my hand. Her fingers were ice cold, and her grip was so tight it almost hurt. But I didn't pull away. I think we both needed something to hold on to. Mrs. Huang had stopped trying to speak and just stood there with her head against her husband's shoulder, her eyes fixed on the building like she was waiting for it to explode at any moment. Mr. Huang kept one arm around her and the other pressed against his chest, and I wondered if we should call someone to check on him. Nobody told us anything. Officers walked past us, spoke into radios, pointed at things we couldn't see. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across rooftops and alleyways. News vans started arriving, parking at the edge of the perimeter, reporters setting up cameras and speaking into microphones with serious expressions. I watched one of them gesture toward our building while talking to the camera, and I realized that somewhere out there, people were watching this unfold on their televisions. People who had no idea that I lived there, that I had almost died there. I tried calling Kavi, but my hands were shaking too badly to type. On the 3rd attempt, I managed to pull up his number and hit call. He answered on the 2nd ring, his voice groggy with sleep. Priya? It's like 3 in the morning. What's wrong? I opened my mouth to explain, but nothing came out. Just a sound somewhere between a breath and a sob. Priya, are you there? What's happening? There's a bomb, I finally managed. In my building, there's a bomb and I'm outside and I don't know what's happening. He was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then I heard him moving, heard keys jangling, heard a door slam. I'm coming. Stay where you are. I'm coming right now. The line went dead and I lowered the phone to my side. Delia looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Was that your brother? I nodded. She squeezed my hand tighter. Around 4 in the morning, a woman in a dark jacket approached our little group. She walked with purpose, her shoulders squared, her expression calm but serious. She stopped a few feet in front of us and looked at each of our faces before speaking. I'm Agent Moira Chen with the FBI. I want to update you on what's happening. We all just stared at her. I don't think any of us were capable of words at that point. She told us they had secured the device. She said it plainly, like she was reading from a report, but I could see something in her eyes that looked almost like relief. The device had been located in the ground floor apartment, in Unit 1. The resident of that unit, Warren Briggs, had been building an explosive over the course of approximately 14 months. The device contained roughly 200 pounds of explosive material. 200 pounds. She said it so matter-of-factly, like it was just a number. But my brain couldn't stop doing the math. 200 pounds of explosives. Directly below my bedroom. Directly below the floor where I slept every single night. Agent Chen continued. If the device had detonated, it would have completely destroyed our building. The blast radius would have caused significant damage to structures within 500 feet. Everyone inside would have been killed instantly. That's when Delia collapsed against me. Her knees just gave out, and I had to grab her to keep her from hitting the ground. She was sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, her whole body convulsing with the force of it. I held her up and felt my own tears streaming down my face, hot against my frozen cheeks. Mrs. Huang started repeating something in Mandarin, the same phrase over and over, her voice rising with each repetition. Mr. Huang pulled her closer and whispered something in her ear, but she wouldn't stop. I looked at Agent Chen, and somehow I found my voice. Why? Why was he doing this? She paused before answering. I could tell she was choosing her words carefully. We're still investigating his full motives, but there were writings recovered from the apartment. Journals, documents, online posts. They suggest he harbored significant grievances against society. He blamed others for personal failures in his life, career setbacks, relationship problems, financial difficulties. He wanted to make a statement. A statement. That word echoed in my head like a gunshot. All of us, me and Delia and the Huangs, we were going to be his statement. Our lives, our bodies, our futures, all of it was going to be destroyed so that some angry man could make a point that nobody would even remember a year from now. I thought about every time I'd walked past his door, every time I'd heard strange sounds and told myself it was nothing, every time I'd smelled something chemical and blamed it on cleaning products, every time I'd chosen to mind my own business, because that's what polite people do. He had been building our death for over a year, and none of us had seen it coming. We weren't allowed back into the building for 2 weeks. The FBI spent days going through Warren's apartment, removing materials and documenting everything he had collected. They found journals filled with angry rants about people who had wronged him. They found diagrams and instructions he had printed from websites I don't even want to think about. They found receipts showing he had been ordering components for over a year, having them shipped to different addresses so nobody would notice the pattern. When we were finally cleared to return, I walked into my apartment and stood in the middle of my living room for a long time. Everything looked exactly the same. My laptop was still on my desk. My coffee mug was still in the sink. My bed was still unmade from the night I ran out in my pajamas. Nothing had been touched. Nothing had changed. But it didn't feel like home anymore. I tried to sleep there that first night back. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old building. Every time the pipes rattled, my heart jumped. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I tensed up and waited for something terrible to happen. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up. I packed a bag and drove to Kavi's apartment, where I slept on his couch for the next week. He didn't ask questions. He just made sure there was coffee in the morning and takeout in the fridge at night. When I finally told him I couldn't go back to that building, he nodded like he had already known. "We'll find you something closer to me," he said. "Somewhere you can start over." My mother wanted me to move back to Delaware. She called me every day, sometimes twice, asking me to come home where she could keep an eye on me. Part of me wanted to say yes. Part of me wanted to give up my independence and let her take care of me the way she used to when I was a child. But I knew that wasn't the answer. If I ran home every time something bad happened, I would never stop running. We compromised. I moved to a new apartment 15 minutes from Kavi's place, and I promised to call her more often. I installed extra locks on my door and signed up for every community safety alert I could find. I started paying attention to things I used to ignore: strange smells, unusual sounds, neighbors who didn't seem quite right. I told myself I would never be caught off guard again. Mr. Tedesco sold the building the following spring. I ran into him one last time when I went back to pick up a piece of mail that had been delivered to my old address. He looked older than I remembered, like the whole ordeal had aged him 10 years overnight. "I can't look at this place anymore," he told me, gesturing at the building behind him. "Every time I drive past, I think about what almost happened. I think about all of you." I thanked him for the text messages, for not giving up when I didn't respond, for borrowing his wife's phone when his died and sending those warnings even though he had no way of knowing if anyone would listen. He shook his head and looked down at his shoes. I should have called the police myself years ago. I knew something was off about that man. We all did. But I told myself it wasn't my place to get involved. I didn't know what to say to that, because I had told myself the same thing. Warren Briggs was charged with multiple federal counts, including attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction. Last I heard, his trial was still working its way through the courts. I don't follow the news coverage. I don't want to see his face or hear his lawyers explain why he did what he did. No explanation could ever make sense of it. No justification could ever undo the fear that still wakes me up some nights. What I learned from that experience is something I carry with me every single day. We're taught to mind our own business. We're taught not to be paranoid, not to assume the worst about people, not to make accusations without proof. And most of the time, that's good advice. But sometimes the warning signs are real. Sometimes the quiet neighbor with the strange habits is exactly as dangerous as he seems. Sometimes you have to trust the urgent message at midnight, even when every logical part of your brain is telling you it can't be true. I was 15 minutes away from becoming a statistic. 15 minutes away from being a name that people would forget within a week. I'm alive because a 68-year-old landlord refused to stop trying to reach me, and because something finally made me run when my walls started to shake. If someone you trust tells you to run, don't ask questions. Don't wait for proof. Don't convince yourself that you're overreacting. Just run. It might be the only chance you get. If you want more stories, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from.